The Numidium. What exactly is it and how was it so powerful? How did Tiber Septim use it to conquer all of Tamriel? And why did Dagoth Yor try to replicate it? To answer these questions, I'll need to explain a few fundamental facts about existence in the world of Nirn, so bear with me. Basically, the Elder Scrolls universe is a dream that sunk. There are essentially two forces that existed in the beginning of everything: change and stasis. The personification of stasis was called Anu, and the embodiment of change was called Padme. For the purpose of explaining what the Numidium is, the concepts of stasis and change can further be broken down into the ideas of yes and no. Anu represents yes, Padme represents no. Anu says that yes, reality should remain constant, and change shouldn't exist. Padme says no, things should happen and change, and that reality as an immutable concept doesn't exist. Where the two forces of yes and no clash and overlap in the space outside reality is called the Orbis, otherwise known as the Grey Maybe, because in between yes and no exists the idea of maybe. The Orbis contains basically everything that we see in the Elder Scrolls games and lore. It includes Mundus, Oblivion, Aetherius, and the Void. Once the Orbis was formed, Anu and Padme each created avatars to represent themselves within it. These were called Anuel and Sithis respectively. Now, Anuel and Sithis were essentially just the slightly diluted forms of Anu and Padme, and had little agency of their own, being so close to essentially just being binary representations of yes and no. So, in an effort to gain more agency for their causes, they repeated the actions of Anu and Padme by giving birth to Auriel and Lorcan. Once Auriel was born, he stabilized the chaos that Sithis had brought into the Orbis and created time. With time being formed, the other gods found it easier to take shape in the mortal realm. Basically, what happened was that Anu and Padme argued over whether existence was really a thing. This created Anuel and Sithis, who argued over what existence should be. And this created Auriel and Lorcan, who argued about how reality should be built, which eventually resulted in Lorcan tricking a majority of the newborn gods into creating Mundus, which is the layer of reality that Tamriel exists in. The Aedra, the gods that Lorcan tricked, are referred to as the Earthbones, because they basically became the bones that form the foundations of reality. They're not dead, but they're not really alive either, more or less being comatose from the effort they exerted to create the world. As was previously established, every god down to Auriel and Lorcan were a derivative of the arguments for and against existence. Well, as more and more gods formed, and the arguments between yes and no became more and more complicated, new concepts to say yes or no to were created, and gods formed to represent these concepts. For example, Akatosh is the god that says time being linear and stable is important. When Akatosh is damaged or injured, time itself breaks and stops flowing properly, leading to multiple opposing things being able to happen at once. The gods that formed Mundus were essentially tricked, or agreed to if you believe Lorcan's side of the story, into binding their concepts together to create something greater. A plane of reality where all the concepts of yes and no could mix and create new ideas, not just argue about the ones that had already formed. Thus Mundus is just another mixing ground between all the arguments and concepts that originally spawned from Anu and Padme's battle for the soul of existence. Now, stepping backwards just a bit, since we've established just what the Orbis is, let's call attention back to the fact that reality is essentially an argument between the gods of yes and no. More specifically, let's highlight that arguments are spoken. So reality in the Elder Scrolls is vocalized. This is where the Dwemer and the Numidium come in. If reality is basically just the result of the gods speaking and arguing with each other, then reality is a sort of sound. Sound in the real world can be manipulated and tweaked. It can be altered by everything from physical space to technology. In the Elder Scrolls, various races throughout time have learned how to manipulate the tones of reality to their own ends. The Nords and the Dragons have the Thu'um, which essentially speaks the user's force of will into existence via the trained voice. The Redguards have sword singing, through the use of song, and an unbreakable desire to make one's combat prowess manifest. Ancient Yakutan sword singers were able to manifest spirit swords, known as Shi'ai. These blades could cut nearly anything and were as unbreakable as the user's own will. They might have even been able to cut atoms in the most extreme cases, if some stories are to be believed. Still, perhaps the most useful and powerful of all of these sound-based disciplines of reality manipulation is that of tonal architecture. This school of world-bending sought to pinpoint the exact mystical frequencies that could affect reality in distinct ways. The Deep Elves used their mastery of tonal architecture to create things such as their unaging armors and timeless works of machinery. The dwarves were able to do this because they were a race of scientists, engineers, and machinists at their core. They were also the first mortals to look deeply into the universe and realize that everything they knew wasn't exactly real. Remember that the Orbis and thus Tamriel are both essentially just existing in a state of maybe and argument. Neither Anu or Padme can agree on whether reality should exist, or how it should exist, so what mortals live in is essentially just the current argument that they're having. making reality not an unchanging thing that can exist all by itself, and that, in theory, could cease to exist if the argument between Anu and Padme ever stopped or if they ever reached an agreement. This horrified the dwarves, who then basically decided that they needed to escape the Orbis altogether. They figured that if they could just climb out of Nirn, into the Orbis proper, and then again tunnel their way out of the Orbis, and into the layer of existence that Anu and Padme themselves occupied, then just maybe they'd be safe from being at the mercy of those two continuing to argue in order to sustain reality. The dwarves basically wanted to transcend into a higher dimensional space so that they could truly exist and stand on their own 2 feet. They didn't want to be reliant on any gods to sustain the reality that they lived in. So that brings us to the Numidium. The Numidium is both just another dwarven automaton, and also so much more. It was designed by the tonal architect Kagranak in the First Era. The dwarves, being among the first to understand reality, designed the Numidium to be powered by the heart of Lorcan. Remember Lorcan? The god that basically got all the Aedra on board with creating Nirn? Yeah, some of the elven god heroes turned on him and ripped his heart out, but he had basically tied himself to Nirn in such a way that the only way to truly kill him was to destroy the planet. No one wanted to do that, so they just shot his heart across the world and eventually a red mountain formed on top of it. Anyway, the dwarves figured out that Lorcan had basically created Nirn as a training ground for spirits and their descendants to eventually realize that the Orbis wasn't either real or not real, and for them to then learn how to ascend into the realm of Anu and Padme and perhaps even beyond. So Lorcan basically wanted everyone to do what the dwarves wanted to do. The only difference was that Lorcan thought that it was a great thing that nothing was real, because that then meant that everyone could escape the falsehood and then become actually real by transcending as the dwarves planned to do. The dwarves, on the other hand, were both appalled, terrified, and furious that reality wasn't real. Still, the heart of Lorcan held the powers of a god whose philosophy was close enough to the dwarves for them to be able to use it for their own ends. So, upon getting their hands on the heart, the dwarves prepared to use it to power their giant, 1,000-foot-tall war robot known as the Numidium. If things had gone their way, then the Numidium would have basically used Lorcan's powers and the dwarven understanding of reality and how to manipulate it in order to punch a big hole in reality by rejecting it and then slipping through that hole to escape it, all the while bringing along the entire dwarven race with the Numidium. Things did not go the dwarves' way, however. Kagranak either made a mistake, or Lorcan's heart simply refused to be used in the way the dwarves intended, because the entire dwarven race disappeared at the exact moment that Kagranak attempted to essentially plug Lorcan's heart into the completed Numidium. What probably happened to the dwarves was that they became the brass skin of Numidium. It sounds weird, but in the Elder Scrolls the skin is a metaphor for a race's culture and how it affects their beliefs. For example, the High Elves are haughty and gene-obsessed, thus their skin is golden and free of all blemishes. The Orcs were once elves, but upon having their god hero struck down and corrupted into something altogether bestial, their skin became gnarled and animal-like. The Chimer became the Dark Elves when Azora turned their skin purple as a reminder of their turning away from her light. So, when the dwarves who believed that reality didn't exist and placed all their hope in machinery and science all tried to harness Lorcan's heart, they became the skin of the machine that they had built as a symbol of rejecting existence. What this means is that, although Lorcan in his heart might not have believed that reality was some horrible thing, that the dwarves did. Thus, when the Numidium was eventually activated later on, though with a power source that wasn't exactly the heart of Lorcan, but still had Lorcan's essence within it, the god's powers were filtered through the cultural beliefs of the dwarves, represented physically by the Numidium skin. The result was that the Numidium could essentially deny reality, as the dwarves had, and that reality would then question itself and stop existing to an extent when challenged by the golem. Time would break, the brass giant could win entire wars in a day, and it could deny the existence of its enemies so strongly that the world itself believed it and would then delete them for the Numidium. The tragic thing for the Dwemer at least is that, as we mentioned, they never actually got to power Numidium with the heart of Lorcan, since instead they all became the skin of their creation before Kagranak could complete the activation of it. The Tribunal, the living gods of Morrowind, would then whisk the heart of Lorcan away from the Numidium shortly after discovering the Dwemer's disappearance. This was when the three gods were still mortal. They would later go on to use the heart to achieve their apotheosis. When Tiber Septim, the first emperor of the human empire, would later invade their lands, the Tribunal would hand Numidium over to him as a peace offering. The three gods did not, however, give Tiber Septim the heart of Lorcan, as they would have lost their godhood without it. This didn't bother Tiber, however, as he simply ordered the construction of an artificial soul gem known as the Mantella. Though the truth of the story is somewhat debated, Tiber would somehow get the soul of a Shezarene, an avatar of Lorcan, into the Mantella. Basically, the soul of one of Lorcan's avatars was just close enough to matching Lorcan's divine energy signature that Tiber actually managed to use it to boot the Numidium up. Though, considering the fact that Tiber himself was possibly a Shezarene, it's possible that this might not have worked for anyone else. Regardless, it did work for Tiber, mostly anyway. The Emperor used the Numidium to finish his conquest of Tamriel and to subjugate everyone who had not bowed to him already, with the exception of Morrowind, which was granted some level of autonomy, as had been agreed, and the inner swamps of Blackmarsh, which had no real tangible value to the Empire. It was at this point that Tiber's royal battle mage, Zurin Arctus, would confront Tiber and, in an effort to stop what he saw as the Emperor's endless quest for domination, destroy the Mantella and cripple the Numidium. At this point, however, Tiber had already become the emperor of the entire known world. The destruction of the Numidium, while a loss and a major blow to his military strength, did not keep him from reigning for 38 more years, and leaving behind a dynasty that would last much longer after that. The Numidium would later be activated only once more. During the events of Daggerfall, the player character is able to restore the Mantella, and thus create a dragon break, one of those aforementioned occurrences when time stops working right. As a result, a major war in the Iliac Bay was prevented, the orcs became citizens of the Empire, the Underking was laid to rest, and Manamarco, the king of necromancers, both did and did not become a god. And, of course, the Numidium was finally destroyed. Despite the fact that it allowed a single man and his legions to conquer the entire world, it's possible that the Numidium would have been even more powerful if it had been fueled with the actual heart of Lorcan, with the soul of a Shezarene, although resembling Lorcan's power, not quite being the actual real deal. During the events of Morrowind, Dagolfur would attempt to build a new Numidium, powered this time by the actual heart itself, though he fails. If he had managed to activate the replica of Numidium, and if it actually worked, then he likely would have been able to easily smash through the ghost fence and spread his corpus blight to the rest of the world, though he was stopped by the prophesied Nevermarine hero of Azora, and promptly slain thereafter. In conclusion, the Numidium is a giant 1,000-foot-tall dwarven colossus, partially made up of an entire race of people, that was designed to reject and break reality itself, and it was also used by an entirely different race to conquer the majority of the known planet. The Numidium is essentially an artificial god of No, and it's inarguably the strongest weapon ever brought to bear on Nirn. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. This is definitely one of the crazier bits of lore in the Elder Scrolls series, although it does get a little bit more crazy if you dig deep enough into it. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe if you like this content and want to see more of it.